All right, today's program, In Response, Shifting Architectures and Painted Landscapes, brings together artists, architects, and scholars to examine and respond to the themes of place, space, and abstraction through works in the exhibition, Julie Mehretu, a mid-career survey of the artist's work that unites 40 works on paper with 35 paintings dating from 1996 to the present. The show is installed on this floor, and this is a sort of general chronology of her career from 96 to the present. And on BCAM 1, we have 8 of her monumental works. And then the small gallery off of this, this third floor gallery are the works on paper in what we call the Bridge Gallery. My name is Christine Y. Kim. I'm the curator of this exhibition, which was 6 years in the making. It started with conversations that I had with Julie in the fall of 2000 when she was a new artist in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem, and I was a new curatorial assistant. These discussions, at the time that have only grown since then, included locating Harlem within immigrant narratives, the fallout of 20th century liberation movements, the complexities of first and second generation identities, her family roots in Addis Ababa and Alabama, and mine from Seoul, Korea. The 1960s situationists, psychogeographies, and memory. Wall drawing as architecture, residue, vibration, and dust. She did her first wall work in 2001 as part of her Artist in Residence exhibition. East Asian calligraphy as a marriage between script and dance, and the tensions of abstraction within and beyond European traditions and modalities, among other explorations. These are just some of the ideas that have stayed with me for the 2 decades and have come into both the survey exhibition of her work and are part of this public program, In Response, Shifting Architectures and Painted Landscapes today. Together with my colleagues in education and public programs, Naima Keith and Consuelo Montoya. Consuelo, where's Cello? Thank you so much, Cello. Her organization for today has been extraordinary. This program has been designed and envisioned as a way to open up possible points of entry into Mehretu's work in the context of this exhibition and to enhance and expand extant discussions. Participants include Josette Bushell-Mingo, an English theater actress and director of African descent based in Sweden. Mira Henry, design faculty at SCI-Arc and co-principal of the design firm Current Interests. Kulapat Yantrasast, founder and creative director of Y, an integrated design studio with workshops of buildings, grounds, objects, ideas, and museums. So the way this is going to work is I will introduce each of the speakers just before they speak. This is designed as a roving in-gallery program, so we're starting in this space here with Kulapat speaking, and then we'll move into the next gallery that has work roughly from 2011 to 2016, where we'll hear Mira Henry speak, and then move over into the final, I guess, the most recent work, 2016 to the present, and hear from Roy and from Josette. And each speaker, and so we'll take these folding chairs and move them from gallery to gallery. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 5 to 10 minutes for questions and to open up to discussion. We ask that you keep your questions or comments concise so that we can give everyone who wants to contribute an opportunity to do so. And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, the fabulous Kulapat. He's a founding partner and creative director of Y. Born in Bangkok, Thailand, where he graduated with honors from Chulalongkorn University, Kulapat received both his MArch and PhD degrees in architecture from the University of Tokyo under a Japanese government scholarship. Upon graduating, Kulapat worked at Tadao Ando's close associate for 8 years in Japan. In 2012, he was named one of the art world's 100 most powerful people. He's a frequent public speaker at leading institutions around the world and has served on the Artists Committee of the Americans for the Arts and of the Hammer Museum. He has also served as a trustee of the Pulitzer Arts Foundation and the Noguchi Museum in New York. In 2009, Kulapat received this Silpatorn Award from the Thai government for his contribution to contemporary culture in Thailand. He's the first architect to receive this prestigious award. So welcome, Kulapat.
Well, thank you very much. It's such a meaningful time in this Sunday for everyone to be here. And I have to say, this is my first time, even though I talk maybe I not need, because I have this?
Okay. No, you're good.
Okay, so I'm just running around.
Yeah.
So I can move around. Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, I think this is my first time that I have this movable feast kind of talk, which, to be honest, it's rather nerve-wracking, and, in a way, thank you for coming. First of all, this is, I love Julie's work for a long time, so it's such a great honor and delight for Los Angeles to have the debut of her exhibition, amazing curated by Christine and her team. And I think, as an architect or designers, I'm sure that we all agree that it's almost impossible not to fall in love with this work because of the quality of drawings and mark makings and the layers that she put onto the work itself. So I want to hear from all of us because I'm sure that we all, have something to contribute to this conversation. But before I, kind of ask you all to comment and give some thoughts, maybe I have a few keywords I want to share, at least how, what Christine mentioned, for me, the point of entry into the work, which is very complex, but also very important to our times, in my opinion. So the first one that I think, and I'm very obsessed with that works on drawings, her drawings in the other room, in the Bridge Gallery there. If anyone has a chance to look at that, there's a series of drawings and diagrams based on migrations and movement that happen there. They're all very small in the vitrines. Might be too small for us to all gather together, but during the break, if you have a chance to look at those drawings, some of them from the 90s and some of them from the 2000s, these are very, in my opinion, very telling. You really see her obsession, her interest about migration, about time, about current affairs, which is really, when you look at the abstract work like this, you feel like, how is that related to today? The wars, the migrations, the conflict, the aspects of contemporary life we live every day through media. But they're all in there in all these layers. And those drawings over there give me some hints about who she is, what information she takes in, and how she was able to really process those information and data with, thoughtful emotions into this amazingly complex art form that is. So I think the mark making is definitely the first keyword that I felt Julie really represent all well in her case. Especially, to my own heart is this first gallery over here, that work over there. Some of the works are untitled. They're from late 90s. Some of them are monotone, just black and white, and some of them are in colors on this wall. I can stay there for days just looking those mark making, because it really talked about the history of mankind in mark making, from the caves to the map to things like that. And sometimes we forget that map is not just about geography. Map is basically a concept of a diagram that has place and time involved into it. How do you go from A to B, in what sense? I think a map is definitely one of the most fundamental aspects. And what we understand, the concept of map today is only in the Western map. If you look at even Aboriginal paintings or Native American drawings, they're all maps in some sense. They talked about how place and time connect and where your place in that world is. Right? And in that sense, we are so used to looking at map in the Western sense, in a modern sense, as a kind of a projection of area from sky to earth. But map in beginning, it wasn't like that at all. It was memory, it was what you feel, it was how you project yourself into the universe you lived in. And I think in that sense, her work really is, what I would call four-dimensional works, a four-dimensional map in that sense. So, of course, we talked about mark making. Now, let's talk about why I think her work is kind of four-dimensional. Because, in a way, in architecture, we have a weird kind of process of working. Because in our head, when you dream up a building, a space, a room, it's kind of three-dimensional in your head, right? You have to draw it onto a piece of paper which is two-dimensional, right? And from the two-dimensional, you're trying to use a computer, CAD software to make it into a three-dimensional tool on your computer screen on some drawing, so you can actually envision what's in your head as a 3D work. And from the 3D or 2D drawings, construction drawings, you try to construct the world in 3D, with the contractors, with the client, and you build architecture. And then once the architecture is lived in, it has a life into the presence. Then it becomes 3D and 4D in the sense of memories and other things, right? So it's a weird trade because you travel from 3D in your own head and you try to script it down into 2D, which is limiting by your skills of writing or mark making, and you try to transfer that with the help of engineers into drawings that someone else can build. It's a very weird profession, I would say. You have really no control about what you can do because unlike artists, we actually most of the time don't build our own projects. We rely heavily on contractors and builders to build our dream. So in that process, the mark making, the diagram, and the drawings are the promise, are the contracts, how you turn from 3D to 2D and back to real life. So I'm saying all of these because I want you to appreciate what the work is trying to do. I hope you have a chance to see them. When you look at these, how many layers is in each of these, the drawing and painting? 1,000, right? And I think when you look at that, not only that she mastered the technique of layer, almost like tracing. I never, maybe Christine can answer, but in a way, this is almost like when you train as an architect in the old school like I did, when we have tracing paper, which kids now don't use tracing paper anymore, they're all computer. But, way back when, you put a layer on, you draw it on the tracing paper, you put another tracing paper, which allows you to see the layer beside, and you can draw on it. Sometimes it agrees, or sometimes it's against the layer under, and you put another layer of tracing on top of that. And the way that she applied acrylic paint on it allowed a different layer to see through, but it also have a depth to it. Something happened before until something happened after. And I feel that in that sense, she's taking something which is basically two-dimensional, which is a painting. It's not just a sense of layer per se, or even the sense of depth. Because, we might feel like with her composition and lines, it seemed to have a sense of dynamic and depth to it. But the part that struck me the most is that it incorporates narrative, whether she talked about migration, whether she talked about destruction of war, talked about, prejudice against people, talked about other things that happen in newspaper and happen in textbook every day. She did in a way that, it's not screaming at you. It's not trying to say, there's not an emotional manipulation in a way that some of the kind of social work would do, but the layers she put on here is allowing you to actually look at it from where you want to be. If you want to have a pleasure of looking at something delightful and very complex and interesting, you can have that. But if you look deeper, you start to understand the symbols and the motif, and sometimes very literal, like the building behind you. Sometimes it's about migration, sometimes it's about the natural world. All of these is really, the more you look, the different layers you can get on. And I think for that notion, I felt that her work, which start from, if you look at the work in the 90s over there, they remind you of some of the indigenous map making or mark making that really have an intellectual exploration about space, about how one relates one bodies towards space. And then as it go on, the different layers and different other system of mark making allow it to have much deeper reading into it. And so I think that's why I think it's the curator suggests that we have people like me, architects and designers, to come and we will have a conversation with you, because we all can help one another try to detect and really enjoy this system of makings. I think that's part of that. And maybe the last keyword that I would leave today before we have a conversation with everyone is the idea, of information. I thought a lot about abstraction and how it is seen as a great, invention of the modern time. But I'm so seeing how abstraction, which in a way we all work in abstraction, how limiting it is to life and how limiting it is to emotions and narrative. I was at the Venice Biennale this year in the Indian Pavilion, show one of the older Indian artists. The work, to be honest, is not my cup of tea. I didn't feel it speak to me at all. It's very representative, very motif-driven, traditional, shall we say. But there's a quote by the artist on the wall, and he said, "How can I be abstract when I live in a country which have almost 1 billion people?" Which is kind of a fascinating thing to think about, because abstraction, in some sense, sometimes is seen as the intellectual way of enjoying art, enjoying mark making and paintings. And now we see this, the emergence of representation in paintings again, whether it's figures, whether it's motifs or landscape or even all of that. You see more and more of painters doing that work, but maybe 10 years ago that was all abstraction. But the point I'm trying to make here is that within her works, you can really see this fusing and coming together of something that happened in your head in abstraction, or something that happened out of distillation, which is abstraction in mark makings. But you also see representations and real representing of objects. Like the one behind, the one that you made in Berlin behind you, is maybe one of the most literal, because you actually can really see the buildings in there. And you ask yourself, why would that happen? And I think once you read into the book and a narrative and read about when she was making the work, the reaction she had, you can understand that, in a way, the architecture in that particular painting represents, in a way, the victim of war, of destruction. And then the erasure of architecture, of monuments, of cities, is talking about destruction. All of that, in a way, it's my own reading, but it's very subtle. It allows these things to play, but it doesn't just there as a way to try to kind of get you to react emotionally. It's there to represent, to talk about her point of view. So anyway, I come to maybe the first conclusion of my talk. Hope to hear from you that, again, for me, the meaningful work is, again, the system of mark making will not continue as long as humans have itch to express themselves. In a cave in France, in the papers behind classrooms, or even in the digital time, mark making will here. But then on top of that, the dimensions of how things move from 1 dimension, 2 dimension, 3 dimension, and 4 dimension in the sense of memory, and how it relates to time and current affairs in her work is something I felt no one else, at least in our time, has done that. So I hope at least I'm providing some point of entry for our conversation today. Thank you.
We'll take a few questions or responses to the response, if we have any.
Talking about map making, most maps have a legend and tells you what you're looking for, kind of, and symbolically. Is there a legend that is translated from this map? If I look at this, are there certain symbols that I could take to other areas and help me understand the painting? Is there, in looking at, you mentioned using graphics and dance, are there these lines representing movement of some sort that we could translate in other drawings? In other words, from the viewer's point of view, do we have references within the drawing that could help us interpret other drawings?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. And I'm sure that Christine has a lot more to answer about that. But my own answer, if you can get back to that, I think you're right. In the map as a tool, as you say, have legend, because it's a map from someone made to someone else to read. Right? I don't think her work literally functions as a map in that sense, even though there's an aspect to it. But in a way, the clue, at least to me, is, again, if you look at the works on paper room, which is the low ceiling over there, I think you will find some answers to your own question there. Because nothing is literal in art, especially the art of this kind of sense of level. But when you look at when she was tracking, the migration pattern, as you call it, the movement of the moon, and the way, I think her own story of migration is a big part of that. A lot of these is almost self-referential, to the point that she's not trying to signify any kind of meanings, or this is not there for you to detect from A to B, right? But if it's a tool at all, for me, it is an urge for you to really try to understand all these. And I think, maybe, I'm sure it's not her intention, but when I look at these, and I look at some of the, indigenous or aboriginal arts, whether it's from Australia, which is very well known, or even very Native Americans, it has a sense of that, because when you look at that, we can look at it as artwork. A lot of these are made on high, or before canvas was imported in. So it's not something that they use exactly in the modern maps kind of sense, but it has, in a way, an artistic kind of expression to it. So I would say that maybe in order to answer your answer properly, I think we need to go back and look at some of the drawings she has done. Yeah. Anything to add, Christine?
Well, I loved your response, but I think what I would add to that is, in addition to, as an immigrant herself, and she said this before, that a lot of her practice is about trying to kind of locate herself within, sort of what it means to be an American, a human, a queer woman, any number of things in the 21st century. And so this idea, mapping can be thought of finding one's way via GPS or a map or a diagram, per se, or it can also be about locating oneself within intersecting trajectories or places. And this painting, Stadia, in particular, is maybe a great example, because it was done in 2005 for the Carnegie International. And if you look closely, you'll notice there are deconstructed sort of corporate logos. I think there's like a CBSI, there's deconstructed Turkish flag, Russian flag, other types of corporate logos, and icons and motifs that we see in kind of stadium and politics in different spaces of spectacle. So in some ways, that's kind of maybe locating the stadium as the function of the stadium, the performance, the competition, the nationalism, the patriotism, rooting for the home team. So that may not be a kind of mapping in a sort of formal way, but certainly mapping in terms of locating who we are, where we are in a certain moment in time in a certain place.
Question?
What kind of materials are used? I'm wondering what kind of materials, what the colors, what kind of, what is it made of? What kind of materials are involved in the process?
Of making these works, you mean?
Yes.
Well, you might have to answer that. Well, it's more to say acrylic and paint and ink. So I think, but there's definitely techniques to that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think when you look closely, again, when you look at that, sometimes I thought she was drawing on two sides of the tracing, which sometimes we do as architects or designers. So you draw on one side and the other, and the transparency or translucency of the tracing kind of conceal but expose the deep layer on the. I think there's a lot of. I mean, I'm not the expert on that, but when you look at these, there's a lot of techniques that are just so complicated, and you can't help looking at when they say what the media is and when they say acrylic and paints, like, that's not enough. There has to be something else, right? But I think it's in her, this is the best room that you can really learn about this technique, because if you go from the very first mark makings or paintings over there all the way to the end, you really see the evolution and interest that she has in not only the subject matters, but the technique is itself its own kind of discovery, for sure. Yeah.
In front of these two paintings, being Higher 1 and 2 from 2013, we will have our next speaker, Mira Henry. Mira is a designer and educator. She is the co-principal of the collaborative architectural design practice Current Interests and is a member of the design faculty at SCI-Arc. Mira's built work is grounded in notions of material specificity, color relationships, assembly details, and engagement in critical cultural thinking. Her formal research and writing focus on architecture, race, and materiality. She is the recipient of the 2019 Architectural League Prize, Henry Adams AIA Award, and Archiprize International Gold Medal. She has participated in numerous symposia, lecture, exhibitions, and reviews at institutions nationwide, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton universities. Mira's work and writing have been featured in the Harvard Design magazine and the recent book Sessions 2. Forthcoming publications include essays in Log, Pigeon, and Architecture League 2019, book titled Just. Mira holds a Bachelor of Art History from the University of Chicago and a Master of Architecture from UCLA. Mira.
So I'm gonna do this because we're gonna talk about Ether Venice. And we're gonna talk about these paintings here being Higher, and then I'm also gonna sort of lob a sort of a series of comments about Invisible Sun, which is behind us. But I really want to do this without notes, but I had to write a couple notes down, and I was also scribbling down some notes from Kulapat's conversation because. Where is Kulapat? He's around, he's there in the white. But I'm so glad that he brought up this idea of these different regimes of representation, which is to say there's, what does it mean to make a map, let's say in a Western sense or in a contemporary sense of how we normally read maps? What do maps mean in other kind of histories and other cultures? And I think that if I were to think about that as an example of sort of different kind of regimes of kind of cultural production and representation. I think what's so powerful about Julie's work is that it moves between all of those things and forces a sort of, it forces, I think her work forces the question about how we situate kind of the ways in which we see and value in really, really provocative ways. So I'm going to start with an anecdote, which is one of the early encounters I had with Julie's work. This was one of the first projects I worked on trained as an architect when I was out of architecture school. This was around in the mid 2000s, and this was in New York. And I was working on a project in Battery Park City. It was a corporate headquarters, the Goldman Sachs corporate headquarters. And then we were also working on, we just finished working on the renovation of their corporate headquarters and then working on this huge hotel that they had purchased. And they had this idea about a very large public space that would somehow exist within the kind of super private walls of their kind of domain. And it was a really interesting project, and I was a part of the team to work on a sort of narrative and kind of design detailing of this kind of idea about a public space that would go from the Hudson River to kind of, I think, West Ave or something, and go through two different buildings. And part of that narrative was kind of terminated at the kind of monumental piece that Julie had just been commissioned to do, which was mural. And if you go to the gallery, I guess it's the Bridge Gallery in this like hexagon, you'll see video of her working on mural. And it's an architecture, right? It's to say that it's a painting at such a large scale, requires so much instruction to be able to be executed at that scale. And it's beautiful. And it's let's say aesthetically, kind of much like many of the pieces in this room. But one of the things, a lot of lines, a lot of abstract colors. When I first met Julie, I told her that this was a really meaningful piece for me, and kind of in my mind, in my mind's eye, and kind of my first job out in the world, and building project, let's say. And she said, I located mural specifically in that location. I asked to be specific. This is an 80-foot mural. It's massive. She was 40 when she was commissioned this piece. It was an amazing piece. I located that where I wanted it because I asked to be right there because it was right across from a blast wall. And I thought, so a blast wall, for those who don't know, it's a wall. In this case, this was a ground floor, and it was a kind of storefront, all glass, right on the ground floor. And the rating on that glass, is kind of has a certain amount of thickness and a certain the glass is engineered to withstand a certain amount of impact, right? So we could say that if we were thinking about architecture, certainly in terms of projecting ideas about space and use and function, but also architectural materials themselves are sort of designed to kind of manage the public life, kind of public use, right? And I thought this was kind of an amazing moment for me to thinking about Julie's work. And let me open up my notes for a second here. That her 80-foot mural is across from this blast wall, and I thought, well, this is like a new way for me to think about her work, a way, let's say, alongside what I would imagine is the sort of the abstract and the pictorial, which is to say that the material itself is in some ways like that blast wall. It is in some ways sort of a constructed, tooled, engineered surface that, much like the blast wall, sort of must kind of withstand. Record, let's say, impact, right? And so this is, in some ways I look at many of the paintings, all of her work, I think, in some ways I think about as a blast wall, as a sort of surface that's recording the impacts of life. And it's done so with such brilliance because of its layering and its depth. But it made me think about, like, when I was asked to do this conversation, what does it mean to think about Julie's work in architectural terms? What does it mean to think about, what are the themes that arise when we think about her work regarding architecture? And certainly, I appreciated Kulapat's kind of intro and really thinking about and talking about what it means to draw an architecture. What does it mean to the relationship between the 2D to the 3D to the 4 dimensions, which is to say the spatial lived kind of experience of an architecture. A lot of the kind of say conversations and discourse that architects have tend to, depending on where you are, tend to kind of live at that level of the 2D, maybe 3D, because so much of what we do exists in those drawings and in those instructions that we produce. So I'm going to turn to this piece here, Ether, in parentheses, Venice. And this piece it's huge. It's massive. But I imagine it as a sort of. I love the idea that the name of the painting is ether, right? It starts with an A-E, but in some ways it's referring to kind of ether, like a sort of atmosphere. And I think about the sort of cloud of, imagine like Venice itself being swept up in a cloud and turning, and what's left over is just a series of very, very thin lines of drawing. And then you have this overlay of these very, very large sort of gestural sweeping lines, thicker, a little bit tinged, right? Of course, the drawings themselves, the sort of facades that we see are sort of projection drawings, perspective drawings. They're kind of zooming in and out. They're non-static, kind of staccato. But they produce a sort of atmosphere themselves. And then there's these other lines that go around it, and I think about that sort of kind of dance between this kind of thick and thick lines, which are the sort of somehow this kind of idea about movement, and then the sort of very stilted, thin, kind of delicate lines of the buildings that are sort of zipping in and out in this canvas. Of course, there's also inversions, things are flipping upside down, right? And so all of the sort of ideas about the architectural drawing is somehow trying to kind of concretize and make clear a sort of a spatial idea. This is all very much being kind of undermined in a piece like this, right? When I look at this piece, I think a lot about the history of projection drawing and perspective drawing, say something that is related to sort of Western canon, like in Italy, the Renaissance, right? Early 15th century, like Brunelleschi, like kind of developing a sort of idea about how to construct a clear idea about the world through lines. And those forms of drawing really assumed a sort of distance, like let's say a subject-object distance. The subject, the person who's drawing it, the object, the thing that they're trying to draw, right? And it relied on that in order to construct this idea of the perspective drawing or the orthographic projection. Of course, this is also, if you think about that history, it's also kind of tied to kind of the history of let's say, early ideas about reason and philosophy and ideas about trying to construct in those drawings a sort of truth about the world, which I think in a contemporary context can also be understood as kind of relating also to a sort of kind of hegemonic idea about how maybe one perspective can produce a sort of truth about the world, right? So the perspective itself is not a neutral, let's say, drawing style. I think Julie's very aware of that, right? And so I think the fact that it is in her tool set and the way that she draws, and it also then becomes a sort of way of kind of using that tool set, but also undermining it in some ways, let's say destabilizing the sort of stable sort of methods of drawing, I think are really elegant and powerful. I think about these very thick gestural lines, and I think about how maybe the facades themselves, these sort of thin line drawings, the perspective drawings themselves, could maybe let's say, be in somehow in concert with the gestural lines. So if you think about like a perspective drawing, it's imagined that, right, there's kind of like a single sort of, everything's like coming to a single point, kind of a clear set of projection lines, right? In this case, if I were to think almost that these thick colored sort of gestural lines are sort of almost the construction geometry of this mess, right? Of this messy sort of atmosphere of drawings, I start to produce a whole different sort of image about that tool, let's say, that atelier, where the person or the people who are making that drawing are having to kind of move and dance and do all kinds of things. They're not sitting properly in their chairs, let's say. And I like that. I like to think about this idea of this concert between the subject who's working, right, and now having to become a bit more active, right, and then the drawing themselves producing this sort of kind of messy and yet completely masterfully sort of constructed environment, right, in a 2D plane. So I'm here, right, I'm walking through the gallery, and I'm looking at this piece, right, I just come through here, I'm going through, just like the curators say, I'm supposed to go this way, so I'm going this way, right, I'm walking through, I'm here in her world of sort of perspectives flipped on inside and out, mirrored and all this stuff, and I'm in that jazz, right, and then I turn, and I'm here at these paintings, and I'm just like, oh my God, right? Like this like kind of insane, right, mind-blowing sort of jolt, right? Which is why this room to me is so powerful, because this room has this sort of kind of beautiful sequencing, this sort of pitter-patter between, right, this world, right? This world of somewhere between line drawings and cosmograms here happening, right? And then we have like the total collapse, that subject-object distance of the person drawing the thing in the distance is completely collapsed, and you have this body and bodies, right, slapping against the surface itself, the canvas itself, right? So this gave me chills when I looked at these pieces in relationship to one another, and I think about the spatial relationship of the pieces, let's say, in the whole exhibition, and particularly in this room, right? For me to be in this mental space and then to be in this mental space, and think about sort of what does it mean to collapse that distance? What does it mean to collapse that distance between what it is that you're trying to convey and the body itself that's trying to convey that, and those things somehow now merging kind of fitfully, let's say, right? And I think about David Hammons and his sort of set of body prints where he's rolling on the canvas, right? And then I think to myself, this is not a single body, right? This is not one subject, right? This is like a mass of people slapping up against this canvas, right? And it says the title, Being Higher, right? Like being higher, like being higher 1 and 2. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, okay, this is like a sort of, one could imagine a sort of binary between these kind of worlds, right? We have like the cognitive, kind of visual, kind of logic, and then we have the like corporal, erotic, you know, physical, right? And then I'm like, no, it's not that simple, yeah? It's not. These paintings, and this one in particular, you know, it's, there's a lot of rubbing out. There's a lot of erasure that's happening, right? Right. You can see. I love, you know, that moment right up there, right? So everything's kind of washed off, except for those fingerprints you can see better than the ones down below, right? And I think about the idea about time and her work, and then it goes back. I come back to the architect in my mind and think about perspective drawing, and I think, well, this has nothing to do with that, right? Well, so maybe we can think about architectural drawing not just as a sort of representation of like a building, but as a series of instructions, right? As instructions to construct something, to build something, and I think this says a lot about instructions. Instructions and like how instructions and how high can you jump? Like how high can you jump? That's what the instructions of this are. How many times can you hit this surface? How many times can you hit this surface before someone washes you out? Right? How many times can you make your mark before it gets smudged out? Right? How many times, or measurement? Like this is about like. About instructions and measurement. How high is the highest point that you can jump, like on a basketball hoop or something, right? And so there's this kind of beautiful sort of direct urbanism about this piece, about these pieces, but I'll speak of this one specifically, you know, of all of the marks that happen over time, and maybe because there was a very clear instruction, or maybe because there was just an instruction of like, oh, this is just a big blank wall, I've got to tag it. Or this is a big blank wall, I want to see how high I can jump to hit, how I can touch the top of it, or something like this. So this is this other kind of world of to me, which is related to an architectural conversation about her work, which has to do with, let's say, something in the world that is related to use, abuse, a sort of, and also, let's say, people in the world related to their built environment, and how much agency they may have to their built environment. I think about a little bit like what you would say to somebody to build a sand castle, right? Like to build a sand castle, maybe you wouldn't have to draw that for them to have to build a sand castle, right? You would say, put as much sand and make a wall as tall as you can until it starts crumbling, right? This is to me the way this painting is working, right? Or build the sand castle for as long as you can until the water washes it away, right? So when I was here in this gallery, you know, I saw some really great, you know, little girls come up and go like this, and people taking pictures of them. You know, it's like there's a sort of kind of identification, let's say, in a piece like this, and probably other paintings don't have in the kind of body of work that's represented. But that identification and that desire to sort of stand just so in front of this painting is a sort of kind of a physical response to the work, which I think is something that I think all the paintings seem to have. I also noticed that to look at this work is to kind of move around it, right? I watched others and I watched myself looking at the work, right? It's not just zooming in and out like with your eyeballs, or like it's not just zooming in and out on these paintings, also side to side. You know, they're so very big. How do you see these paintings, right? These are spatial questions, right? And these to me are also architectural questions, right? And this maybe leads me to my kind of last point, which is that and I might read it, because I kind of wrote something that I thought was like, well, let me say that. That perhaps my final point about what it means to think about her work architecturally is to acknowledge the spatial and phenomenal aspects of her work, right? So let's say beyond the pictorial field, that I see her work as objects in space that produce spatial effects, right? So along with, let's say, the cognitive movement, right? How our minds start to move when we're looking at this work, there's also a sort of physical movement, right? That the work sort of starts to incite and inspire. So if we went from, let's say, this painting here, where we have this sort of spatial sort of distance, kind of spatial game of a subject and object, and a sort of collapse that takes place here. If you were to start to look at some of the paintings behind us, and when we're done, when we move, we can get up and kind of look at them a little more closely. But the paintings in, let's say, the Invisible Sun, these kind of dark gray paintings, these paintings, you know, the first time I saw them, it was kind of overwhelming because they have a particular sort of visual, the kind of vibration. And so to look at them is as if you're looking into something very deep and very three-dimensional. And the two pieces here, the one right in front at the end of the gallery and then to the left here, are titled Invisible Sun, and then they're in parentheses, algorithm, I'm not sure, something and something. But when I was looking at those pieces, you know, they have, they're muddy, they're gray, they're super gray. But there's also a particular type of paint or effect of the paint. There was also high degrees of reflectivity. So it's almost, to look at them, there's a lot of it, when you get closer, it's really reflective, and it almost like pushes your eyes away from it. You almost can't see it fully. You have to kind of go to the side or go to the side to sort of see it. And I thought, you know, when I looked and read that it was said it was called Invisible Sun, I was like, I turned around and I looked and I was like, what kind of sun are you talking about? What is this invisible sun? It was like this kind of really naive and lovely response that my body had to the work itself. And then I began to look at it much deeper, and I started to think about, like, these paintings are like full of debris, full of kind of shrapnel, and I began to think about, what does it mean that she calls it invisible sun? What does it mean when there's an invisible sun, right? It means that you're in an atmosphere, in an ether that's so dense you can barely see out, right? You can barely see that. It's palpable, that hot heat, that sun, it's palpable, but you can't see it. And I thought, well, you know, she has us inside the painting. She's telling us that we're inside the painting, that we are in the painting and we can't see the sun, because that's how far we are. We are in now the painting itself. Now this, to me, I think is a really kind of profound idea about somehow trying to not just collapse the distance between, let's say the subject and the object, or the person who's doing the work and the thing itself, not just the collapse, but a sort of inversion, where suddenly she is somehow trying to produce an effect of us inside the shrapnel and debris and barely being able to see out. So I'm going to leave it at that. I think that it's these to me are kind of profound ideas to be working on a two-dimensional surface, and are also deeply connected to the sort of phenomenal and spatial sort of aspects of architecture, which I hold very dear. Thank you. Any questions? Questions?
Do we have any questions for this group, for this area?
Maybe I'll try to, I wanted to add something. So, you have music?
Yeah.
Or you can is this with you?
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm going to just add to what you were saying about identification, because I think that's such an important thing in the work, and there are many different types of identification. And in Being Higher 1 and 2 in particular, there's this kind of interest in kind of identifying for the artist, not just for herself, but for kind of all of us, really, and back to kind of what we were talking about with Kulapat, about locating and situating within a kind of mapping, Western mapping context, and outside of that is to note that she made these in 2013. So we're talking Occupy movements. This was post-Tunisia, Egyptian revolution. I don't know if it was before or after the second Egyptian revolution. Black Lives Matter. I mean, there are just so many things happening around the world. But then in New York, Hurricane Sandy hits. And I'm letting you in on a little secret here. So her studio, which is in Chelsea, was closed off for 2 weeks because the whole ground floor was flooded and far on the west side. And like a lot of people, residents and workers had to evacuate that area. So she made these in her apartment in Harlem, where she didn't have the projectors and the accoutrement and the razor sharp pens and all of that, and taking in, and also Syrian civil war, refugee crisis. I mean, I can just go on, and if I really think about 2013 and we remember back to that moment not so long ago, and so this idea of kind of wanting to have some identification and by implicating her own body, I mean, when you have nothing else, I mean, quite literally for her, unplanned, vacate your studio at home where, materials and resources and space are limited, and that kind of as another way into this sort of who, where, am I, and how is this all operating? So anyway, just to throw that out there.
I mean, I think that it's that impulse to try and collapse the sort of high technique and sort of immediate kind of gesture is so present in so much of her work, and so to see it distilled in this way is, I don't know, it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
All right, our final speaker is Josette Bushell-Mingo. She is an award-winning actor and director based in the UK and in Sweden. She has acted in the Royal Shakespeare Company, the Royal National Theatre, and the Manchester Royal Exchange. Josette received an OBE, Order of the British Empire, from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II for services to the arts in 2007, and has received numerous awards such as the Judy Kramer Award for Innovation and the South Bank Cultural Diversity Award for her work in changing the face of Black British artists, and the Granovic Award for her contribution to the arts. As a director and teacher, Josette has taught and directed in Stockholm, Malmö, and Luleå theater schools, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Arts, and the Tisch School of the Arts at NYU. Josette was recently artistic director for the Riksteaterns Tyst Theater and is now head of acting at Stockholm University as the first woman and first person of African descent to hold the position. Last but not least, she is writer and star of Nina, a story about me and Nina Simone, making its US premiere, as Cello said, on January 15th as part of USC's Visions and Voices. And I wanted to just mention a connection with Julie's practice. She has her studio practice, of course, where we're seeing the products of, but she also has started an artist residency called Denniston Hill in upstate New York for primarily of color and queer artists, and she's been involved in a number of organizations in social justice. And one of those was about 3 years ago. She, along with her fellow artists, Ellen Gallagher, Rashid Johnson, and Andam Pendleton, bought the childhood home of Nina Simone in Tryon, North Carolina. And it was risking destruction, and they donated to Natural Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C. And I mean, thinking about Nina Simone and her work, not just as a musician, composer, songwriter, performer, singer, pianist, but also her work as an activist, and that sort of duality that many artists have in their practices of activism or social practice and art is something that I wanted to mention and highlight as well. And I'll hand it over to Josette. Thank you so much.
Can everyone hear me okay? Oh, yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a little jet lagged, I'm afraid, but it's a delight to be here and to be introduced to Julie's work. Thank you for the introduction, particularly concerning Nina Simone. It wasn't planned, it just turned out like that. So I will spend a little time, I guess, like everyone else, reflecting. But what I thought was most appropriate was to share with you one or two of her songs, if that's okay. No, don't applaud until you've heard the voice. You may choose to do that afterwards. But I would actually like to respond by singing it to the painting, if that makes any sense, rather than to you. You'll hear it fine, I promise, but I want to sing. And to be honest, the painting that's actually pulling me from the back is that one. This is the one that's actually speaking to me, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But this first verse, if you like, it's to all the work that Julie has done. Birds flying high, you know how I feel. Sun in the sky, you know how I feel. Breeze drifting on by, you know how I feel. It's a new day, it's a new dawn, it's a new life for me. Fish in the sea, you know how I feel. River running free, you know how I feel. Blossom on the tree, you know how I feel. It's a new day, it's a new dawn, it's a new life, and I'm supposed to feel good. Stars, when you shine, you know how I feel. Scent of the pine, you know how I feel. Freedom is mine, you know how I feel. It's a new day, it's a new dawn, it's a new life, and I'm feeling good. Thank you. Thank you. I suppose the thing is to be in the same room as another artist using her art as activism, as revolution, as change. And it's been great to be amongst so many eminent speakers here this afternoon. In one sense, I feel completely out of my depth, and at the same time, there is something that's striking me about the work. The layering and the secrets hidden within it, the aggressiveness of it, with the drawings that I have seen and the paintings that I have witnessed now, there's always a feeling that somewhere underneath is hidden something. The work that I'm doing around my journey with Nina Simone finds its echo a little bit in her work. That underneath this, and whatever you are seeing as this body of work, within it is held such a complexity. And the journey of art is to allow us the bridges and the rooms and the spaces to understand what that complexity is. I'm fascinated and have been fascinated by all of the signals and pointers that she is making towards us. One of the second speakers spoke very much about work dragging you in. Good art should drag you in and pull you through journeys. What I find with this piece of work, although its description is about an aggressiveness, The piece that I do about Nina Simone, I don't play Nina Simone, I don't play Nina. I explore a dilemma which I think is hidden somewhere in these paintings. I explore the dilemma of being a person of African descent, and I'm speaking through this body. I know, as I say in the work, it happens to everybody. What I'm going to talk about is happening to everybody, but I'm going to just concentrate on this black body, this black story, this black person, black like Nina Simone, black like Julie. I'm going to focus just a little bit on that and say that the dilemma that I deal with is, what do you do as an artist when you understand your history, which is a history in one sense of pain, slavery. One has to also beg the question, who writes the history, which is what's so amazing about this, because she does it herself. She writes it herself, she layers the work herself, she decides, as was spoken just recently, nothing here is casual. She is choosing every single mark, every single story that is told. The piece of work that I deal with is, what do you do when you know your history, when you know slavery, when you know what happens, when you know the consistent brutality against people of African descent, black people of African descent? What do you do with that rage? And I talk about rage rather than anger. I'm angry if I don't get my right mixture of coffee at Starbucks. I'm angry there. Rage is something else. Where do you put it? Where do you put it? Langston Hughes talks about a raisin in the sun. I'm sure many of you know the work of Langston Hughes, both poet, activist, writer. He talks about a raisin in the sun, and he talks about what happens to a raisin in the sun. Does it dry up? Does it sink? Does it become soft and gooey? Does it harden? What happens to your rage, and where does it go? And somewhere in this work, I get a sense of that. What I've noticed in every single piece of work, maybe I'm wrong, I need to see the whole exhibition, but one of the things that always draws me is this line. There always seems to be one of these lines. There's one there. There's a huge cross. There's another there. All the way through, and I wonder what that cross is. This one reminded me here of the cross that slaves made when they couldn't make their own signature. And this one here is some kind of angle. I'll speak a little bit about this one, because you're all the experts, because you know the work. This one, in the piece of work that I do about Nina Simone, a combination of reflection and 16 of Nina Simone's magnificent songs. One of the things that I do is list. I actually list the people who, African descent people, black British people, who were murdered most recently. And I was struck by this particular, it was the first one actually I saw, and I sort of went, what is this? What's going on? But it was funny, the one that I was drawn to more than this one, so I apologize. I need to stand behind the microphone. And then I made a list. Emmett Till, 14 years old, accused of rape. White racists beat that boy to death, cut his penis off and stuck it in his mouth. Mississippi, August 1955. Then there's the continued killing of African Americans. Do you remember Michael Brown, 18 years old? And it goes on like this. It goes on. And who is this picture about? Who is it about? Conjured Parts. As its title suggests, Ferguson links disembodied anatomy with a site of violence and political strife. This painting began with a blurred photograph of an unarmed man with his hands up facing a group of police officers in riot gear, which was taken during the protest that followed the fatal shooting of Michael Brown, Ferguson, Missouri. I had no idea that that was there, and that the black and white picture is layered behind here. Somewhere in there, his hands are raised. Somewhere. Julie's work reminds us that after a time, we will become covered. Our stories will be erased. And somebody else also brought up from an architectural perspective the idea of maps and guides, secrets and keys in. And the work reminds me, through her, that there are certain ways that if you look closely, to the person, if you look closely to the art, if you look closer, you will find the very essence of what it is she's trying to say, who is hidden there. But also, there's a kind of feeling that as well of holding things in place. Holding things in place, several images layered on top of each other and keeping them fixed in place so they do not move, so they're always there, so they're always captured. The piece of work, as it's played, really looks at the journey of that dilemma. What happens when you know your history, and where does it go? She has chosen to place it in the work, but as was pointed out, her activism is huge and is a crucial part of why she creates. One of the biggest challenges, I guess, is whether the work makes impact or not, and to whom. Where is the difference? Where is the change? Are you changed by seeing this? Are you changed? Will you go out into the world and be changed by this work? Or does it affirm something? Does it affirm how wicked we are or how good, our triumph or our sacrifices? Does the work change you? I have to ask myself that, even when I do Nina Simone on stage. What does she want us to think when we leave here? What does she want us to understand, not only about our humanness, but also our culpability in it? Are we changed today by this work? I wanted to conclude a little bit, if I may, with one more song. You applaud, wait for it. No, but yeah. Just hold on, I'll just have a look. Was I going to say anything else really interesting? No. I was going to continue to be boring. So this other piece of work is a song written by Nina Simone. It's a song layered into all of these paintings, I think, somewhere. And it's called For Women. It's a song that she wrote. She wrote the song really in deep frustration as to how women, but particularly black women, were treated because of the color of their skin or their sex. And the song is called For Women. This time I'll sing it to you. Actually, I might sing it for Michael. My skin is black, my arms are long, my hair is woolly, my back is strong, strong enough to take the pain again and again. What do you call me? You call me Mammy. My skin is yellow, my hair is long, between two worlds I do belong. My father was rich and white, he raped my mother late one night. What do you call me? You call me Yellow Girl. My skin is tan, my hair is fine, my hips invite you, my mouth like wine. Whose little girl am I? Anyone who can abide. What do you call me? You call me Sweet Thing. My skin is brown, my manner rough. I'll kill the first motherfucker I see, 'cause my life's been tough. I'm rather bitter these days, 'cause you made my parents your slaves. What do you call me? You call me Peaches. Thank you. Thank you, Julie.